The problem at the Australian National University is ANU Council, not the Interim Vice-Chancellor. And by ANU Council, I'm talking about appointed ANU Council members. And I'll go through some of them in this video because it's about time that the ANU community and others were introduced to them properly. Hi, I'm Lachlan Clossy. I'm the ACT Division Secretary of the National Tertiary Education Union, the NTEU. We're getting a lot of questions about what's going on at ANU after the Saturday Papers story this morning. So here's a short video which won't go through everything for the last 2 years in detail, but will fill you in on what's going on right now. The very quick recap is that Professor Genevieve Bell took over as Vice-Chancellor in January 2024. Julie Bishop, meanwhile, has been Chancellor since 2020. For any non-university folks watching, the Vice-Chancellor is effectively the equivalent of a CEO, but usually with more academic leadership. The Chancellor, on the other hand, is effectively the chair of the board. The board, depending on which university you're at, might be called a council, might be called a senate. At the ANU, it's ANU Council. Now, I'm not going to go through all the problems and poor decisions under Genevieve Bell, like closing childcare centres on campus or sending cops to break up student protests or having a second job at Intel. I'll even skip over Julie Bishop's conflict of interest issues, like having staff working for both the ANU and her personal consultancy, Julie Bishop and Partners, or her office engaging a former business partner to write speeches with ANU funds. There are potential conflicts of interest everywhere, really, but more of that later. A lot of people who would also be aware of the significant cultural issues that have now been brought out into the open as well. The main thing to be aware of, if you're not already, is Renew ANU. This was a plan for mass job cuts at the ANU, announced at the start of October 2024. It aimed to slash salary expenditure by $100 million annually as part of a plan to cut costs by $250 million annually, with employee expenditure sitting at $816.8 million annually in 2023. These salary cuts mean more than 12% of the workforce, and we estimated that to be 638 full-time equivalent positions. The problems in a financial sense clearly stem from leadership, governance, and financial management failures over a long period of time. But that didn't stop Genevieve Bell also attempting to vary the enterprise agreement, which wasn't even 12 months old, to take away a staff pay rise. That was emphatically rejected by staff. Julie Bishop doubled down, being quoted by media referring to ANU staff as inefficiencies. The NTEU held a vote of no confidence in both Bell and Bishop, with more than 800 people participating in a poll open to all union members and more than 95% of those voting no confidence. The year or so following the announcement of Renew ANU in October 2024 was a rolling mess that included 14 separate change proposals, which between them proposed hundreds of job losses. After ruling out voluntary redundancies early, the ANU caved to union pressure and instituted voluntary separations as well. No job losses are great, with maybe one exception, but if they do happen, it's far better that they're voluntary. It was also a disaster zone as far as psychosocial hazards were concerned. People at the ANU were really suffering, and many still are. ANU was ranked as very high risk in the sector-wide psychosocial climate survey. NTEU members campaigned for better university governance and against forced redundancies. We argued that the financial rationale was not made out and that ANU weren't being transparent about their numbers. We argued against the millions of dollars being paid out to outside consultants like Nous to come in and suggest where jobs should be slashed. And we argued that the ANU needed a new leadership direction or a new leadership. On the 11th of September 2025, following sustained pressure from union members, politicians, media and others, Professor Genevieve Bell resigned as Vice-Chancellor. It would appear, looking at ANU Council minutes, which have been released subsequently, that Julie Bishop cut a deal with her and then took that to Council to approve. It involved Bell returning to her substantive position on a 5-year contract worth $2.5 million with other funds for research on top of that. The ANU's provost, Professor Rebecca Brown, became interim Vice-Chancellor. I'm going to say 3 things about that 2-week period. Firstly, the Saturday paper article, or maybe those who leaked highly confidential material, implies that Brown had an apparent plan to remove Genevieve Bell as Vice-Chancellor. I'm not sure that's what the leaks actually suggest, though. It seems to me more like suggesting that any action or complaint should be made against objective performance criteria. Secondly, out of Julie Bishop and Rebecca Brown, I only met one person in early September where leadership change at the ANU was discussed, and it wasn't Rebecca Brown. Thirdly, suppose I'm wrong about the first part and Brown was part of seeking leadership change at the ANU. My reaction would be good. Genevieve Bell's leadership, fully supported by Julie Bishop and a clique of appointed ANU council members, was incredibly destructive to the ANU as an institution and incredibly damaging to so many members of the ANU community, both professionally and personally. So if Rebecca Brown did have a role in leadership change, I'd say that's a good thing and looking out for the interests of the university. So what's happening now? Professor Rebecca Brown has been pretty good as Interim Vice-Chancellor. She's been empathetic, has sought feedback, has involved the ANU community in decision-making, has recognised and apologised for the harm of recent years, and importantly, ended forced redundancies a week after taking over. However, she does appear to be being undermined by some staff internally, perhaps those loyal to Genevieve Bell who resent her because she's now Interim Vice-Chancellor, and apparently by members of ANU Council. Things came to a head in February as Professor Brown had been overseeing an investigation into serious misconduct allegations against Professor Genevieve Bell. In February, however, members of ANU Council intervened. The Saturday paper reported that at the meeting, and this is a quote, members of the Australian National University's Governing Council yelled at and pointed aggressively at Interim Vice-Chancellor Professor Rebecca Brown before asking her to leave the room. ANU Council lined up their own alternative process, which ended up with allegations against Bell being dismissed. And now, according to this report, apparently ANU Council, or Julie Bishop in particular, has instigated a legal investigation into Rebecca Brown. Frankly, I share some of the concerns of ACT Senator David Pocock, who today stated that he was concerned about what looked like they could be attempts to scapegoat the Interim Vice-Chancellor in a context where ANU Council could be held accountable. And that context is basically where we've got reports coming from several external entities, including the Higher Education Regulator. They're conducting investigations into the ANU, and those reports are due to land soon. They could implicate ANU Council. Well, why do we as the NTU care? Well, for three reasons. Firstly, Rebecca Brown has done a good job as Interim Vice-Chancellor. She has attempted with some success to calm the situation on campus and has ended Renew ANU, especially the forced redundancies. Nobody will get everything right, but she's got a lot right. Secondly, ANU Council members have not been held accountable for their role in Renew ANU. I'm going to go into some of the failures in a little bit toward the end of this video. Frankly, ANU Council's continued involvement with the ANU is part of what's making it hard for so many to move on. Thirdly, we're concerned that some of these same ANU Council members are not committed to moving on from Renew ANU or committed to moving on from other forced redundancies. If Rebecca Brown was forced out, we're concerned the job cuts could well be back on the table. So let me introduce you to some ANU Council members. Julie Bishop needs almost no introduction. She's been Chancellor since 2020. Alison Kitchen joined ANU Council in 2021. She became Pro-Chancellor, effectively Julie Bishop's deputy, in 2024, but stepped down earlier this year and went back to being an ordinary ANU Council member. However, she resigned effective immediately from that role too a week ago. Larry Marshall joined ANU Council in 2023 and replaced Alison Kitchen as Pro-Chancellor earlier this year. Rob Whitfield joined ANU Council in mid-2024, and Wayne Martin joined ANU Council in mid-2025. Now consider this statement from today's article. Julie Bishop, who spent 20 years in federal politics, has never seen anything like it. Alison Kitchen, a director of the National Australia Bank and chair of their audit committee, has never seen anything like it. Wayne Martin, a former Chief Justice of Western Australia, has never seen anything like this in the legal profession. Rob Whitfield, who spent decades at Westpac and New South Wales Treasury, has never seen anything like this in corporate Australia. I'm absolutely gobsmacked at how Machiavellian it has been. It may be that this statement is a complete surprise to the people mentioned in it. but it seems very particularly crafted in a way that seems a bit too convenient. Recently, Four Corners extensively covered how consultants have got their hooks into the university sector, including KPMG. You might wonder if that is why this statement doesn't reference Alison Kitchen being the former national chair of KPMG, where she spent 40 years, including 30 as a partner. You might wonder why a former Chief Justice from Western Australia is on ANU Council, and whether it has anything to do with knowing Julie Bishop for at least a decade, probably longer. At least he wasn't there for the start of Renew ANU, I guess. You might wonder if the reason that the bio of Rob Whitfield doesn't mention that he is currently on the board of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia, because of concerns that it could be a bad look if too many people knew that he served on that board for 4.5 years with Genevieve Bell. I mean, Larry Marshall doesn't have his name in this statement. That's a good thing, I guess. Though people in Canberra certainly haven't forgotten the mass job cuts he oversaw at CSIRO, and many are also aware that he's on the board at Fortescue. Of course, I'm not at all suggesting that these are anything other than highly credentialed professionals, but to understand how ANU Council operates, you also need to understand that these appointed ANU Council members don't reside in Canberra, are flown in for ANU Council meetings, stay at the hotel together, dine together, some exercise together. It's all pretty cliquey, and there are often pre-existing relationships. People get onto ANU Council through the Nominations Committee, a subcommittee of ANU Council. The chair of the Nominations Committee is the Chancellor, Julie Bishop. And until September 2025, it also included Alison Kitchen and Genevieve Bell. So the Pro-Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor, as well as the Chancellor, all have ex officio positions on that smaller subcommittee of Council. What that effectively means is that Julie Bishop, and for some time Genevieve Bell, had a significant say in who came onto Council. While the Minister for Education approves nominations, I'm not aware of any ever having been knocked back. Julie Bishop's position, meanwhile, is determined by members of ANU Council. Yep, the same members Julie Bishop helped put onto Council. Any decision to remove Julie Bishop would also have to be made by ANU Council, including by those same people. Again, I'm not suggesting that anyone has done anything improper in any of these processes, just that the governance structure provided for by the ANU Act has allowed this situation where there is a group of people with pre-existing relationships who each have a role in ensuring the continuity of the others in their positions, or people getting into those positions in the first place. That's the problem when it comes to accountability. They're all only accountable to each other, and so far, no appointed members on ANU Council who are appointed based on a skills matrix to bring their skill sets onto Council for the purpose of oversight of the university have faced any genuine accountability in relation to Renew ANU. The whole purpose of appointing these corporate types to ANU Council is to apparently ensure that the university is run properly as an organisation. That clearly hasn't happened at the ANU, but they're still there. Never mind that hundreds were sacked on the basis of a projected $200 million underlying deficit in 2024, or that deficit was actually overestimated by $60 million. Whoops. Or that those job losses continued in 2025 based on a projected underlying deficit of 110 million, which ended up being overestimated by 65 million. Whoops, they did it again. Or that they discreetly paid down $100 million of debt while overseeing the sackings of hundreds because ANU was in a poor financial position. Or that this has been devastating to the ANU's reputation and has resulted in extensive and ongoing psychological damage. It may be that this lack of accountability is why TEXA is currently investigating the ANU. In fact, there are 3 investigations we're waiting for the results of. ANU is conducting its own investigation into the allegations from the Senate hearing into university governance in August last year. The Australian National Audit Office is investigating the financial situation, and TEXA, the higher education regulator, is also investigating. And in the last week, TEXA has accepted a voluntary undertaking from the ANU, which hands majority control of a panel to recommend the appointment of the next ANU Chancellor when Julie Bishop's term expires at the end of this year. This is truly unprecedented. It seems like TEXA, as the regulator responsible for higher education, has almost completely lost confidence in the ability of ANU Council to govern the university. We say, fair enough, we've lost confidence too. The Chancellor from the University of Queensland has criticised TEXA's intervention. In that criticism, he mentioned the need for accountability. Frankly, that's the issue. There hasn't been accountability, but TEXA's intervention as the regulator is accountability. And even here you have pre-existing relationships. Varghese was the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade from 2012 to 2016. The Minister for Foreign Affairs for most of that time was Julie Bishop. Now, Julie Bishop, upon Varghese's departure to become UQ Chancellor, said, Mr. Varghese has been a constant source of sage advice during a time of significant international challenges. I have personally benefited from his calm, competent and insightful counsel. The problem at the Australian National University isn't the Interim Vice-Chancellor. The problem is ANU Council. NTEU believes the appointed ANU Council members need to be spilled, including the Chancellor. The longer-term problem is structural. Changes to the ANU Act are needed so that we can move on from this council, but also ensure we don't run into the same issues again. We can't afford to wait until the end of Julie Bishop's term for change at the ANU.